Canadian landscape, we see the use of trusts all over the place. They're used primarily for fiscal reasons, so for protection, for tax minimization, not really for the reason that I think they're intended, which is to be for the benefit of the beneficiary. So I just wondered what your thoughts are on that and what the role trusts could play purposefully for families that we're perhaps losing by focusing on protection and tax minimization.
Thank you, Ruth. Recently, two colleagues of mine, Hartley Goldstone, Keith Whitaker, and I wrote a book called Family Trusts. We had a number of intentions for that book, and they respond, I think, to your question this way. The first intention we had for the book was to ask families to understand that if they are families with trusts, as a term with double apostrophes, that they are the least normative of all families on the planet. Because what we saw was that these families, working with mostly the same lawyers, the same bankers, et cetera, saw themselves as normative. A family with trusts is anything but normative. And families with trusts run the risk that they become their structures instead of freeing their members. That was the first thing we wanted to share with the audience. The second thing we wanted to share with the audience is that we observed that in Canada, as in America and Britain, Australia and New Zealand, if a family retains its means, its financial capital, into the third generation, 90% of its wealth ends up in trust. Even if it still has an enterprise nominally, it's actually owned by the trustees, not owned by the beneficiaries. The tragedy of that 90% figure isn't trusts are good or bad. It is that 80% of the beneficiaries of the trust declare them, when asked, more a burden than a blessing. And only 10% declare them more a blessing than a burden. That's extraordinary tragedy, and you can feel the energy of a family dissipating, the short sleeve proverb, in its dissipation phase, with trust being the vehicle, not the reason, but the vehicle in which the dissipation occurs. Because after all, if your family capital, your human beings, declare their means of connecting to the family, means in the trust sense as opposed to financial sense, more a burden than a blessing, feel the entropy. Feel the dissipation of energy of that family, if that's where the structures take you. So that was the second thing that we wanted to share with them. And then there's a third. I'd said two, but there's actually a third. We wanted to ask a very fundamental question of what the purpose of the trust was in fact. And here we're going to say something very strange. We suggested trustees lie. Suggested the trustees lie, or at least make up something. Because what we know is if a trust isn't a gift of love, then it's a transfer. And in another book that's Keith Whitaker and Susan Masenzio and I wrote called The Cycle of the Gift, we ask there the very fundamental question, are you making a gift or a transfer? Tell me. Because if I'm at the effect of the meteor, it's not something I created, that's coming into my life that I have to adapt to, has it got love in it, or is it a transfer? Is it tax related? Is it control of an enterprise related? Is it worry about a bad marriage, my credit, whatever it is? But you need to tell me what's in that meteor. And that being a beneficiary of a trust means you get a meteor. That's not a normal human condition. So the third thing we wanted to ask people is, are you making a gift of love when you create your trust? And is its purpose to enhance the lives of its beneficiaries? It might do some of those other things, but they're secondary. Because if the relationship between the beneficiary and the trustee isn't grounded in love, and it isn't grounded in the trust enhancing the life of the beneficiary, the trust will fail, become entropic. So it might deal with an enterprise's voting, it might deal with avoiding creditors, it might deal with avoiding a bad marriage financial outcome, it might deal with any of those, some tax saving. But the trust fails in terms of its purpose of growing a flourishing family. I'll go even further and say that we strongly recommend that every trust, before it's created, have a little preamble, and that the preamble have 2 sentences in it. This trust is a gift of love. This trust exists to enhance the lives of its beneficiaries. And then 40 or 50 pages are fine. But now the trustee and beneficiary know what their jobs are. They know what they're responsible to do together.
We have this term that's used, I think fairly often, not only by some of the advisors that work in this field, but also by the media. And it's called the trust fund baby. Mm-hmm. And we want to sort of have we have this other idea of having a really flourishing beneficiary. And really the two are quite different creatures, I think, in the end.
Yes.
And, parents that we work with, what they want more than anything is for their kids to have opportunity for them to receive the gift of love that you're talking about and to help them flourish. And I guess what we would like to understand today from you, Jay, is what have you seen families do that actually help the next generation, the rising generation, flourish as beneficiaries of a trust?
I would say that the most fundamentally useful thing is for the trustee and the beneficiary to have a very grown-up conversation around what is a distribution that subsidizes and what is a distribution that enhances, and for that particular human being. Not what generically subsidizes or generically enhances. That has nothing to do with a trust. A trust is a unique, and it is in that sense unique. And I don't like that word by and large. I prefer different. No, a trust is a uniquely established human relationship between this thing called a trustee and this thing called a beneficiary. And they have to grow up together. And they have to have that conversation. Because subsidies lead directly to dependence. It doesn't matter what station you are in society. We know what subsidies do. I'm not speaking politically here, by the way. Speaking sociologically, okay?
Yes.
Not politically. Subsidies are very, very dangerous to the human spirit. They lead to trust funderitis. They lead to trust fund baby. They lead to something I wrote about called remittance addiction. And I meant what I said. If you can't wait till the check's in your mailbox, you're in trouble. You're attached. Yes, you're in the illusion of something. Enhancing distributions free you. This is what trusts are about.
Absolutely.
They're about growing something, enhancing something, flourishing.
Absolutely.
Not about dependence. But they can create dependence when they make subsidies. So that's what I ask trustees and beneficiaries to focus on.
Fabulous. Thank you.
You talked about the importance of the relationship between the trustee and the beneficiary, and yet I think we can all attest to the fact that our experience of how trustees are chosen is pretty ad hoc. Not necessarily a ton of thought goes into that. So if you were to help families sort of by giving them, here's some criteria that you should be thinking about as you are going through that process of thinking who is the best person to be in that relationship with these beneficiaries, what would those criteria be? That's the first question I have. And the second one is one that Wendy and I both wanted to ask you because we see this a lot, is do family members make good trustees? Or are they conflicted potentially?
The nature of being a trustee is, as I said early on in my book, you have to have 6 arms because you have to do 6 things well. I won't list them, but essentially you do. So just think first that no trustee has one thing to do. It's not in the nature of what the responsibilities are. Second, a person who becomes a trustee is a kind of regent. That is, they're standing in for some period of time between property being owned by one person and eventually owned by someone else. It's never theirs. So it has to be someone who understands it's not theirs and understands that they're standing in as a regent, like in the old days in the kingdoms, if the king or queen was too old or too young or far away or whatever, you had to have somebody. So really the trustee has that function, stand in. Also, the trustee has to be willing to concern him or herself or itself with the well-being of people that otherwise have nothing to do with them. I'll come to family member in a moment, all right? But I'll come to it this way. So the choice of a trustee is an incredibly complicated thing to find someone who understands what it is to be a fiduciary. And fiduciary is small f. This isn't a title. It's someone for whom the act of caring fundamentally from one person to the next person is something that they wish to learn about in themselves. It's a calling, I believe, to be honest, a vocation. So the strange thing in the planning sessions is that very often the choice of the trustee is inherent in your question, is the last thing considered, and it takes 5 minutes because the 45 minutes of the hour have been spent on taxes. But in fact, if you're asking someone to stand in, for heaven's sake, perpetually, which of course is impossible, but just theoretically, in this position of always being in between, that's a very unusual person. And a person who's really concerned about others and their well-beings, that's an unusual person. And a person who's completely trustworthy. That's awesome. So this is an incredibly complicated question. And then actually being a trustee is the most difficult thing I've ever done in my life. Because you have to do 6 things well all the time. The question of a family member as a trustee. Trustees have to do 3 things well. We could think of it as a kind of Venn diagram. Administration, keep the books and the records, worry about the taxes, worry about the laws, etc. Administration. Investment, where they have to be prudent, by the way. They're not like any other investor on the planet because they're limited to only prudent investments. They just can't do what they could do themselves. So that's very unusual. So investment. And then you have the third circle, which is distribution. So they have to do all 3 of those things, and then there are 3 pieces of that, but those things really well, and always continuously, right? So when you ask a family member to be an excellent administrator, a prudent investor, and a humane distributor, it's pretty rare that you're going to find that person. Pretty rare. Now, what's also important to say here, I think, is today, most trustees outsource administration, including institutional trustees. Okay? And most trustees today, because they're required to by law, actually, as well as because it's prudent, they outsource investment. So you could say that a family member could be a good trustee by outsourcing administration to a great institution that's interested in that, and outsourcing the investment to an investor who understands how to invest for trust, not how to invest generally, but for trusts, who's actually had that kind of a clientele, leaving then the distribution function. And they might be able to handle that pretty well, but the question is, what hat are they wearing? Because the trustee has to be wearing only the beneficiary's hat, not the founder's hat. Founder's gone. The founder said what the founder's going to say, and now the trustee has to wear it. So what's the conflict? If I'm the uncle or the aunt, am I conflicted? Am I the cousin? Am I conflicted? In what way am I conflicted? So one way out of this trap, not to extend this, was this. Distribution committees written into trusts who help the trustee with this distributive function, I think, are a wonderful place for family members to serve because they don't have to make the choice. The decision remains with the trustee when the money goes out. Nobody else can make that decision but the trustee. but a place for them inside the trust system of being a member of a distribution committee, that makes huge sense to me, because they probably are interested in the ongoing flourishing of that beneficiary. There's some DNA connection there, there's whatever it may be.
Yeah.
It makes sense to me. But asking that person to really be an excellent administrator, even if outsourced, and a very prudent investor, even if outsourced, that seems to me to be very burdensome.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think maybe where we're going in trust is we're broadening how the system works to better deal with the actual functions that the trustee has to provide.
In your book, Family Trust, you talk about the concept of a letter of wishes, and you've mentioned it a couple of times in our conversation so far. I'm wondering if we can go a little bit deeper there and understanding what do you think are some of the components or critical parts of a letter of wishes that a grantor may want to consider including in their letter of wishes?
The question for the letter of wishes is, does the person want to make a gift, or do they want to make a transfer? So advisor's task is to guide them, and both are fine. I want to make that very clear. But to guide them as to what they want to do. Because if they want to make transfers, which is to be worried about taxes, worried about creditors, control an enterprise, worry about a marriage falling apart and assets going out of the family, then they should say so. The tragedy of those letters, wise people will know when they're writing them themselves, although usually they're an illusion, to be honest. It's what they want, is that they fall very heavily on the person who receives them. That meteor is full of very bad things, if you want a person to benefit from your action.
Yeah.
Now, if you want to make a gift, which is a very complicated thing to do. Loads and loads of brilliant philosophers have said it's easier to make a fortune than give it away, and they're right, at least that's my experience. So to make a real gift, that's important, because real gifts free someone. They ask that person to do things for themselves to bring their dreams to life. They ask them to go on a journey integrating the meteor in a way that they adapt to, makes them more resilient and more competent.
Yeah.
So to me, the letter of wishes question, I repeat, lies in the advisor asking the person who's going to write this letter about why this trust exists, or why this transfer, whatever it may be. What is your intention? What is your intention? Because if the letter doesn't express that intention, it won't mean anything anyway.